To Madinga will say, Abarakabakere, would say to you, well, of Jerejef to you, to Liberian people in my own pera would say, Kasaya Damakuklikukatono, to the Mendes in Freetown, Sierra Leone would say, Kauna. On the other hand, I say to you, Kai Gorman to you. To the rest of the African people, wherever you are, especially the Nigerians in the western part of the country, that is dominantly Yoruba will say Bao Nisha Bao Lomo Otuto Jomenta. To southeastern part of the country, that is Igbos who say one named the number Ikaraka Ijia Chukwu Abiyama Amama Amasi Oshimiri Atata Ikuyeme Chukwu Kike Odoku Akataka. Strengthening all of you wherever you are under the sound of my voice. To the northern part of Nigeria that is dominantly Islamic will say to you Assalamu alaikum. This is a Pan-African driver. Quickly, Mr. Guy, I come to you quickly. Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, the first president of all Tanzania, says that when wise people remain silent, fools multiply. That is the essence. We ought to speak about Africa because we are challenged, we are constrained. This is the continent we belong to. You might hail from Gambia, you might hail from Liberia, other people hail from Nigeria and other countries. But Africa remains our common denominator. And of recent in our political landscape across the entire continent, there has been a new norm, coup d'etat, which leads to what I call the democratic dividends, which happens to be the social contract between the masses and the government. And if you check our continent, there is a massive division shaking everywhere and on a governmental level, so to speak, which it traces to the lack of all democratic dividends across our respective nations. It begs the question, should the new norm be accepted?
I think first we need to understand the concept of democracy in Africa.
Okay.
What does democracy means to people? Democratic dividend is not only about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but again, the social agreement between the people and the rulers. What does it entail? A democratic system of government is one that guarantees the fundamental human rights of the people. It's one that seeks to better the economic life of the people. It's one that guarantees the means of survival. And that ought to be provided for by the state in terms of the law that people believe governs them. The Constitution being the supreme law of the land, obviously gives people the power, the mandate to demand from their governments. And therefore, over the years, what we've seen in Africa is degeneration, that our democratic system is degenerating because it does not address the basic or the fundamental problems in Africa. When you talk about issues around economic hardship, poverty, inequality, for instance, these are issues that countries across the Africa are faced with. And therefore, if we have systems in place, things independent, systems that are not able to deliver these goods, Africa is in a state of loss. Because neither democratic system nor other system have been able to provide Africans with meaningful economic change towards their life. And therefore, democracy over the years, one can argue, although those in the southern part of Africa may have a different argument because democracy seems to be delivering maybe to an extent when you analyze the institutions of the state, the level of political stability there. But can you say the same thing across sub-Saharan Africa?
It's almost alien.
Especially in West Africa, for instance. Things are totally different. And therefore, when we analyze this perspective, we need to put into place, has democracy really delivered for Africans over the years across the continent? The answer is no.
And I agree to that. That's the response here from you, Mr. Guy. If you're following us on TikTok and Facebook, this is Teledal TV, your best online outlet, not only in the Gambia, but the rest of the African continent, where information, education, and entertainment remain our core value here on this platform. Here, quickly, we speak about the democratic dividends, like you spoke about. Southern African nations are doing well in terms of offering the masses, the citizenry, the right democratic dividends that are providing stability in terms of inequality and so to speak. But here in West Africa, the story is quite too different. It begs the question, are we the problem, the masses who elect people into positions of authorities based on sentiment, or is it that leaders that are given amounts of authority to steer the affairs of their respective nation lack the necessary patriotic spirit to offering the best democratic dividends? Or who has the problem?
I think I wouldn't blame the masses to an extent.
Okay.
Because our main problem, I think, is failure of leadership. Governance failures in Africa is the key. Because since independence, we've had leaders after leaders who were not able to transform Africa. We have the first generation African leaders, those who fought independent for Africa, which was vehemently replaced by the advent of military rule in the 1980s. And then towards the 1990s was the period of what? Democratization in Africa. Now we are in that period. But when you analyze in contemporary times the nature of military takeovers, the return of military takeovers across Africa begs us to ask the question as to whether Africa is really sliding backward. Some scholars will call it democratic backsliding.
Or retrogression.
In Africa, which is obviously the case. But again, one needs to analyze the factors. Why military intervention in the first place? Because there are chronic failures of governance deficit across Africa. Just recently, how many coups do we have? In Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and most recently in Guinea-Bissau as well, where some will say that the coup was orchestrated. But then we need to focus on the behavior of governments across Africa itself to understand why these issues are happening across the continent. People in Africa are so frustrated. Recently, I wrote a piece titled Between Democracy and the Gun, because Africans seems to be lost ideologically,
so to speak.
When President Bassirou Diomaye Faye was elected recently, you've seen loud cheers across our neighbors, isn't it? Some other parts of Africa also hailed him. Why? Because he's young, and people believe in the democratic spirit of his nation. But again, when Captain Ibrahim Traoré also became the president in Burkina Faso,
it was hailed and still
it was hailed and still being hailed. And therefore, what that tells us is that what matters to the ordinary African is pragmatism, what actually works for Africa. It doesn't matter who delivers, what system. Is about which system is delivering the greater goods for African. And I can argue that since independence, neither democratic governments or military regimes or autocratic regime have propelled Africa to a level of success. And therefore, the similitude of the problems in Mali, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, problems around insecurity, violent extremism, radicalization, is the problems that you also see across other countries of Africa as well. When I conducted research recently on violent extremism, focusing in these countries, Mali, Burkina Faso, and so on, Sahelian states, to be specific, you realize that the problems that they highlight, economic problems, poverty, these are the major drivers towards violent extremism or leading young people towards violent extremism.
Let's not, you couldn't forget religious discrimination,
religious
tribal
discrimination
as well.
Tribal destruction, interstate violence. These are issues that people look to and they see no hope because our governments are not responsive enough to these societal problems. And therefore, one can also say that we have abandoned the spirit of Pan-Africanism, an ideology that reflects the inner values of the Africans. We don't need to go out and borrow ideologies from other societies.
Not at all.
Because our founding fathers have created.
Set the pace for us.
They have set the space for us to follow in their footsteps. But we seem to abandon that. I remember a quote that Kwame Nkrumah made during his leadership. He said that I am an African, not because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. How many leaders can say that nowadays in Africa?
Most
Before you have leaders that can stood up to the African values at the global stage, whether be it at the UN General Assembly. But nowadays, what you see is almost, many of them are just puppets.
Because they've been baby-fed.
They do not advance the agenda of the African, not in any international platforms or fora. Mugabe used to do that before. At least he was advancing the African value at the international stage. When you look at his advocacy over the years is for Africa to have a representative in the Security Council as a permanent member. Who is advancing that cause now? Recently, it was echoed by William Ruto, but
Of Kenya.
where is the support from other African leaders?
To give it a push.
So for me, I think that there has been a total level of political, social, and economic degeneracy in Africa. And leadership has really played a key role.
That's a very
in that.
strong one there for you. That leads me to, in economics, it is quoted that an economist dealing with human behavior cannot attain the precision of investigation. As such, an economist, generalization or laws are conceived as conditional rather than absolute. That is what is likely to happen under a given circumstance, but not what must happen or always happen.
Definitely.
In other words, the human behavior is unpredictable. There are no scientific formula to measure my behavioral pattern. The best man today becomes the worst man tomorrow.
So.
Tracing that to contemporary African leadership, when politicians at the campaign period, they mount all of the flowery expressions to entice the voters so that they're given amounts of authority to steer the affairs of their respective nations. But once they will have ascended to the position of the presidency, they change. Now, it begs the question, how do we now scan or evaluate or assess potential leaders so that the hope and conviction is there that once they will have ascended to the positions of authority, they will actually offer the necessary democratic dividends as the social contract between the masses and the government? How do we now measure leaders to be very confident that they're going to offer that, so that we avoid most of the challenges that we have now that are leading us to instability?
Leadership is about delivering goods and services, representing the interests of your people from a social contract perspective. When scholars like, or philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau postulated on these points, where they argue that when people come together, they surrender their rights to the state so that the state can govern, steer their affairs in a political system. What they simply mean is that we all cannot enjoy certain rights as individuals, because Thomas Hobbes will argue that any society without government is an anarchic society, a disorderly society. And therefore, that's why you need government, where people surrender their rights to the state so that the state can steer their affairs in a collective good. When Locke talks about individual the freedom and justice, what he was simply referring to is that, from his interpretation, the state ought to represent the interests of the people, to safeguard the individual liberties and freedom. But nowadays, what we have in Africa is leaders perpetuating themselves in power. personality aggrandizement, making themselves rich in power. Because politics in Africa is seen as a profession. Politics is not a
It
profession.
has been commercialized.
And that is the detrimental aspect of it, where every Tom, Dick, and Harry wants to become a politician. Okay? When Plato talks about the philosopher king, what he was talking about is that let men with wisdom rule over society, those who understand the means to govern. But obviously, what we experience in Africa in recent times is deficit of leadership. There are very
massive leadership deficit.
few leaders in Africa that you can point to
that are making strides.
and say that these leaders are making a stride, significant stride. Let me be blunt. Gambia is no better. Mali is no better. Ghana is no better. Sierra Leone is no better.
Nigeria is,
Nigeria is no better. Corruption everywhere. Corruption in government across the barrels of Africa. And this has given people no hope. And therefore, the problems that you have is compounding problems that continue to serve as palpable grievances towards young people. Irregular migration is a crisis, not only in the Gambia. It's not a peculiar problem only in the Gambia, but across Africa as well. Why do you think people are leaving?
There's a push factor.
It's because there's a push factor. What are the push factors? Economic hardship, the chronic poverty. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the poorest places in the world. And therefore, when young people are not giving hope to succeed, the environment to strive, jobs,
alternative route
to feed their families, they will do everything to leave. And I think that is where every African leader needs to point to themselves, because collectively we have failed as a political leadership, not only within ECOWAS, but within Africa itself.
That's a massive message there from my guest this evening here on Teledal TV. Just in case you're following us, this is the Pan-African Drive, a platform meant to build bridges between and amongst the African nation here in our studio in Brussels Bay, Phase 1. Follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, as well as YouTube to get the Pan-African Drive and the rest of our programs here on this beautiful outlet, which happens to be the best online platform, not just in the Gambia, but by extension the rest of the African continent. I am here tonight with my guest, Mr. Guy. Back to you here. As a result of this lack of democratic dividends, like you mentioned in your presentation now, that young people are frustrated if they find an alternative route, going through the high sea, losing their lives unceremoniously. You have tribal distractions and government getting into positions of authorities and monopolizing the system. When I say monopolizing the system for the tribal members, not just it's a continental phenomenon. It's happening across the continent of Africa. The leaders are sent into positions of authorities and then entrenching themselves, like we see the Faure Gnassingbé in Togo, who has influenced the system to remove the presidential limits so that he sits there for life, as though the leadership is for his entire family or himself. Now, what's the way forward for us as a continent of people? Is there any hope and conviction that we're going to get better?
I believe there will be change. We have to be optimistic as a people and as a society. I believe in the ideals of Pan-Africanism, those that were advanced by our great pioneers of independence across Africa. Nkrumah in Ghana, Julius Nyerere,
Tanzania,
Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea-Bissau, Sadala Kairaba Jawara of the Gambia, Leopold Sédar
of Senegal,
from our neighbors, Houphouët Boigny. The spirit was to unite Africa, to make sure that Africa becomes one of the greatest continents in the world, because we have the resources to do so.
Also the richest in terms of
We're
resources.
the richest continent in the world.
Yeah.
but yet we remain poor. Our problems, we know them. They are glaring, very palpable in the eyes of the people.
Somebody say very visible to the blind and
Very
audible to the deaf.
Audible. And therefore, what we need is to build a conscious generation of African leaders. I do not believe in the gerontocratic leadership that we have now across Africa, the old guards.
Yeah.
The future of Africa belongs to young people. And therefore, what we must do is to build a conscious generation of young people, those that will stood up to the African values, those that will be selfless, those that will promote the African agenda beyond their nation states. And therefore, once we do these things, they have to revolve around democratic principles and values. We must build government institutions that are responsive to the needs of the people. You know, if you read this book, Why Nations Fail, which highlights the failure of state institutions, that the state lacking extractive institutions that will control the resources of the state and distribute them equally. And therefore, the books argue that the failure of institutions is one of the major problems that sets Africa backwards.
I agree to that.
We need to build strong institutions. Institutions that will be transparent, independent, and impartial.
This is very important. This point
Yes.
is very important because if you take note of the African continent, and you talk about democracy, and you have a three arms of government. The legislative branch of government makes the law, the judiciary interprets, whereas the executive enforces the law of the land. But at the end of the day, you see that the system in most of our nations have been controlled by the executive, which is a total departure from democratic values. So it's important that you mention points like that. You've got to highlight more that.
That's why I said we must not accept our institutions to be run by individuals. They have to run through the dictates of society or the general will of the people. And that's where democracy comes into play, where people can fearlessly stand strong and ask government to do what it is supposed to do. And therefore, when we live in a system where people can demand for justice, accountability, law and order, equal distribution of resources across the state is very important. What we have in Africa sometimes could be interpreted as an elite capture, where our politics is hijacked by the elites. Our resources are maybe controlled by the few. And therefore, it is very essential we live in societies where people are free to question how government conduct themselves and also distribute resources of the state. The resource crisis across the world. Sometimes when I read the resource cost in Africa, I like to give an example of Nigeria, for instance, the Niger Delta state.
Yeah.
It's where a majority of the oil resources is located.
Bayelsa, the Delta state,
But
rivers,
yet still,
rivers.
They are the poorest.
They're the poorest.
Why? Because multinational corporations conniving with African elites, with government elites. One of my lecturers used to call it, there's a bourgeoisie alliance between African elites and multinational corporations that are continuing to milk the resources of Africa. And therefore, we need to understand these dynamics and see best way that we can control our resources. Because if we don't control our resources, forget it. Look at countries like South Africa today, a black-dominated society, a black land dominated by white monopoly capitalists, where the resources is in the hands of few elites. And therefore, the fight for South Africa now is how can they distribute these resources equally towards Everybody.
Come on, good of the people.
Because they have reached an agreement or a consciousness after apartheid that South Africa belongs to all those who live in it. But the resources in South Africa belongs to few people.
To distribute.
And therefore, it has to be judicially distributed. That is the next fight. And the next fight for Africans or young African leaders is to ensure that there is accountable governance delivered by those that are elected by the people to do so. And failure to do so, people must hold them accountable. We must do this without fear or favor, ensuring that we're not just bootlickers, ensuring that we speak a truth to power, to understand that power belongs to the people. Once we're able to do this, together with building strong institutions, ensuring that there is proper separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative arm of the state, we will start seeing results, obviously. But it does not come overnight.
Okay.
Sacrifices must be made as well.
He says it doesn't come overnight. Sacrifices must be made. That's where I'm going to hold you right there. And we have our first break, and after which we return and then continue the second half of this conversation on the Pan-African Drive with me, Tony Michael Howard, your host. A quick break, and we'll come back shortly. Should I say welcome back here on the Pan-African Drive. A very wonderful conversation here with a young Gambian social scientist and classroom lecturer, Mr. Bidan Guy, who is speaking to us on the Pan-African Drive on different issues concerning our one continent, on how we can build bridges and offer the right democratic dividends as African leaders for the masses as the social contract, which remains the inalienable right of the masses, because once you're given a amount of authority to steer the affairs of a nation, there is a contract from you to the masses. That is to offer the right treatment for these people. Quickly, Mr. Guy, back in the days, from the president for Mozambique, Samora Machel, he says, anytime you hear the West praise me, know that I have betrayed my people. That drives me to the dependence and nature of all the African leadership to the West. Has constrained and challenged them from offering the right democratic dividends to their people, the puppet lifestyle, which you emphasize here. What now can we do? If you go to Southern Africa, if you go to island nations like Port Louis, Mauritius. Among the 54 nations, that is the only continent, embarrassingly, to say that it's a full democratic nation on the continent of Africa, which is a shame out of 54 nations. And then you have several quarters of Africa saying that we are democratic nations when the dictates of democracy are being undermined on a daily basis. How do we filter leadership? I know I must have asked a question earlier, but how do we now filter leadership so that we are quite confident that a leadership is actually a manifestation of the crying, the yearnings, and aspirations of the people who elected them?
It's a very interesting Pan-African angle, dependency. We've been dependent for far too long towards not only Western powers, but big global powers across the world. It used to be only the West by then, but now you have the Chinese in Africa. Of course. You have the Russians were here, and they're still here. You have the Turkish, the arrival of new powers. You have the Iranians also in Africa. You have the Israelis in Africa as well. Doing what? Most of these countries are backed by multinational corporations, milking the resources of African state. Yet still, we're not alive to that consciousness yet, because we are what? Comfortable in the dependency that we live in today. And therefore, some will even link it to sovereignty and independence. Are we sovereign and are we independent?
Are we independent?
These questions are very valid. Why? Because when we ask whether are we capable of surviving on our own or surviving by ourselves, what do I mean by that? Us Africans, collectively living together, steering our affairs without depending on handouts for Western powers. That is not the case. And believe me, it will be very difficult for any African states today to survive without the support from the outside world. Why? Because we have created a system that permitted such to happen, isn't it? The South African, you've seen when Donald Trump came to power recently and said that there was a genocide in South Africa and that they're going to cut all aid towards South Africans. You see how the president of South Africa was to the White House and how other West African leaders also humiliated themselves at the White House recently when President Donald Trump called them, isn't it?
Yeah.
In a statement where he was asking the president of Liberia, he seems to be speaking good English.
Where did you school?
Where were you educated?
Yeah.
Such an insult. And none of them have the guts to stood up to the U.S., to the U.S. president, Donald J. Trump. But whatever the case might be, questions around dependency is an issue that must be addressed by Africans collectively. Remember when the former Ghanaian President Kwame Nkrumah desired to form one single African state. In 1963, the OAU was then formed in Addis Ababa. But prior to that, the determination of our founding fathers was to unite Africa. And remember in the meeting, he told them that if we fail to unite Africa here today, one state, one army, forget about it,
we'll perish.
And since then, we have perished as Africa.
Continue to perish on the daily
and continues to do so. When we talk about regional integration, because dependency, for once to address the question on dependency, we need to focus on regional integration, unity among Africans. That is what the European Unions have done today. They have integrated. That is the most palpable, concrete example of a united people, united in vision. But when you talk about the African continent free trade area now,
it's a challenge,
which is into force today.
Yeah.
But do you feel it?
You don't.
Do you feel that there's free trade in Africa?
No effect on the
There is the movement of people from one place to another. Yes, there could be free movement of people, but goods and
totally free.
services.
Just to cross from here to Senegal is a challenge.
Tariffs. You go to Senegal here, they stop you. Guinea-Bissau, harass you, police. Even Gambian police do harass outsiders as well. So it isn't only peculiar to other countries across Africa, but integration is something that is going to deliver Africa to the promised land. But we must act on it. The document is there. The agreement is there.
We've never lacked legislation.
We never lacked
implementation
legislation.
Has been a challenge.
Africa is a continent of almost 3 billion people.
Of course.
Yet still, we're not able to achieve the desired economic growth that we need. So therefore, we need to look inward. For far too long, we've been looking outwards.
I love the fact that you said we need to look inward, because just like we mentioned Mauritius here, they look at their own nation and say, look, we depend on tourism and sugar, so to speak, but what can we do to become vastly independent as possible, not just by paper, like you mentioned, because most of our nations are independent just by paper, but in the actual sense, we're still hugely dependent in all ramifications. So Mauritius look at a nation and then invest in the human resource base. Free education, not just free, but quality education for the masses, and free transportation for the students, and disabled as well. And then they give incentive to the students at the end of the day. Free medical care for these people. Those are necessary democratic dividends that ought to be given to the masses, especially when people are elected into public office. They're doing something differently. How do we replicate that in this part of the continent?
If Mauritius can do it, and Mauritius has a lot of similarities with the Republic of the Gambia, depend on tourism. They have beautiful beaches and so on. We have the same thing, but we're not able.
Perhaps even better.
Better, isn't it? But then other examples can also be cited across Africa that are doing very great. Rwanda, for instance, they're far more better than other African countries. Remember, this is a country that was ravaged by genocide.
Almost considered a lost nation in 1994.
A country that faced some of the worst egregious human rights violations during the 1994 genocide. But Rwanda was able to stand still, and yet it seems to be moving in the right direction. Although there are challenges that you can say, but nobody cares. As far as the president and the leadership is delivering for his people. One thing that Africans do not care nowadays is ideology or what system is in place, democratic, socialism, or whatsoever. Pragmatism, like I mentioned in the beginning, is the order of the day. So, moving back to answering the question on the dependency, I think there is need for African unity, integration, the solidarity, good leadership in place. That is geared towards uniting the whole of Africa. And therefore, we need to look beyond colonial borders nowadays and eliminate the borders. You know, one of my mentors, revolutionary Pan-African mentors, Julius Malema, used to say, let us eliminate the borders. We don't need borders in Africa. If the Europeans are capable of doing it, nothing will stop us from doing it. But we must have visionary leaders, which is a thing that we tend to lack in Africa nowadays from our leaders. When I look at the crop of leaders that we have, I am not inspired. I am not optimistic of the future. It looks very gloomy for Africans' youth, sadly to say.
Where we are driving to the close end of this very program here tonight on the Pan-African Drive. This is a platform that is meant to inspire and motivate the current generation of young Africans and preach the message of peace and national unity, as well as revamping the Africanization policy that speaks about good governance, social justice, democracy, human rights, and most importantly, the African unity, using the African solutions for the African problem. Now, Mr. Guy, you're a young political scientist who lectures in a state-owned university here. You've seen a huge wave of young people being marginalized across the length and breadth of the African continent as per your research, because you are a research analyst on good governance and social justice. So you're not limited to the Gambia, the nation state. I believe you have experience across the continent of Africa. Young people have been marginalized because of this lack of democratic dividends on the part of leaders, so to speak. We've got to be involved in the conversation. Do you think young people are actively involved in the participation of the democratic process of the state, or we are just men by words and not by means? How involved are we?
Sadly, they're not involved. They're completely marginalized, which is evidence across Africa. When you look at African leadership, contemporary African leadership, you don't see young people there. What you see is what? A gerontocratic pool of leaders. Only the oligarchs from countries like Uganda under President
Yoweri Kaguta Museveni,
and so on. So it is very disheartening to see, because the greater percentage of our population is young people, and young people are the drivers of change. They're the future, and therefore they ought to be involved in every level of governance.
According to the pillars of protective coverage.
But they're not given the opportunity to do so. Let's look, for instance, electoral systems, politics. Young people are not involved in the political processes in Africa. Within political parties, they're not involved. They're only seen as what? Those that are capable of propelling political parties into power.
Journeymen.
But they're not seen as the solution to the inherent leadership crisis that we have in Africa. So I think moving forward, it is very important that governments across Africa find ways of including young people into the political picture, because we are part of the solutions to the problem of African emancipation. And therefore, what you have is constant back and forth enmity between young people and government, which shouldn't be the case. If you go to countries like Uganda, for instance, Nairobi, under President William Ruto recently, when young people went out to manifest their grievances towards government actions, they were brutally killed. In the Gambia here is no better. There is what? Shrinking civic space across Africa, where human rights activists have been arrested, isn't it? The women activists have been arrested. In the Gambia, when young people came out to express their dissatisfaction towards government peacefully, what response mechanism do you have? Blatant abuse of power by the state authorities or the mercenaries of the state, the police in this instance, using vague laws such as the Public Order Act to discourage young people from expressing their grievances. Not only young people, but across the spectrum. And these laws exist across many African states, which they use nowadays to suppress dissent, to discourage people from holding leaders to accountable. And therefore, that shouldn't be the case. Moving forward, young people need to be involved. They are the drivers of change. They are the future of this great Africa that we call home. And therefore, there should be deliberate attempt by government through affirmative actions to engage them. But it is also not a given. Young people must strive for it. We must not just be discouraged by the actions taken by government to brutalize us and make us stay away. We must know that the continent of Africa and our nations belong to us. And therefore, it is only us that are capable of ushering the change that we need. And that change needs to be orchestrated in one way or the other.
That's a great one there from you. Quickly, like I said, we're driving close to the end of this conversation. I want to take you back a little bit to where you spoke about coup d'etat across the African continent, which is a total departure from our democratic values, so to speak. And we're still talking about the democratic dividends, and lack of the democratic dividends get people frustrated, get the masses frustrated, and then they aim for alternative solution. But then, when we speak of the social contract, mind you, it is both sides, in as much as the masses elect people into positions of authority to steer the affairs of their respective nations based on the term limit, be it 6 years like Liberia or 5 years like the Gambia, 4 years like other democratic nations like Nigeria. The masses also have a clause in that very social contract that binds them with the government that if the leadership fails to provide the necessary democratic dividends, you have a choice to go back to the ballot box. to change that decision, to sack them, to fire them. Like if you hired a staff and that staff is not offering you the requisite service that you must have hired him or her for, you have the right to terminate the contract. So why are we not awaiting the ballot box, but we are using alternative force like the military going to have a coup and then remove a stable government? Should that be the new norm? Should we totally accept that? I'll come back to that again.
Just to be clear,
Yeah.
military rule is not the solution, and it's never going to be the solution for Africa, because the primary role and responsibility of the military is not to ascend to political power, is to provide external
Internal security.
yes, to the people. And therefore, when I hear conversations about the masses have a role to play, it seems we're handcuffed by the very elite that keeps saying that.
That is system.
Why do I say that? You said elections as an alternative, which is obviously an alternative way through which people can choose their leaders. It is a way through which we aggregate the level of development that those in power have achieved. And therefore, to an extent, do we choose to stay with them or do we choose to provide an alternative? Let me give you a case in Guinea-Bissau today.
Okay.
A scenario of what happened under President Sissoko Mbalo. He came through democratic means, isn't it? He dissolved the parliament twice during his reign. He refused to organize elections at the right date, citing issues around insecurity and so on, which was just him masquerading that there was a problem in Guinea-Bissau when there was no problem. There was a peaceful and orderly election, which he organized as per ECOWAS observer missions and AU observers. They have stated that the elections were free. They took place in a calming environment. But what happens afterwards? He was not capable enough to facilitate a peaceful transfer of power or even allow the independent electoral body to announce the result, which many believe that Fernando Diaz has won. It is the same President Imbalo that was going around lecturing ECOWAS leaders about the so-called third termism, discouraging leaders from going to third term, and saying that ECOWAS should speak on constitutional third term coups, which was very ideal, which was the right thing to say.
Yeah.
But he presided over a failed system, because the political system in Guinea-Bissau is a fiasco, and that is why you have the military take over. And many believe that he, in fact, connived with the military to orchestrate the coup by himself, because there was no basics for which the military could have intervened. Just wait for the IEC or the independent electoral body to announce the result. Take, for instance, in other places as well, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, Sahelian states, one can say that there is inherent problem of insecurity in those states, okay? Because subsequent government, democratic governments are not able to address the issues around insecurity, violent extremism. Societies have been ravaged. People have been killed by bandits across those states. Boko Haram in Nigeria is no better.
The herdsmen.
The herdsmen. And recently you have President Trump trying to cook up some stories about the political situation in Nigeria.
He described it as a nation of particular concern.
Yes,
you know?
wanting to take advantage of that situation. So I think it is very, in as much as people can say that the masses are at fault, it is not the masses. It is people in power who monopolize or instrumentalize the powers of the state because they have monopoly of violence. They have the power to exercise violence against the civilian. They have we have seen instances where people reject election results. In the Gambia, it was through the intervention of ECOWAS. That's why we have a change in the Gambia, isn't it? So I think it is very important to understand the dynamics as well. We can vote in elections. We can go out in elections. But what happens after elections? Leaders can't change or manipulate the election results. They can decide to rig the elections to their advantage. What will come out of it? And it is the same legal system or legal instruments in their respective constitutions that permeate such to happen, isn't it? And therefore, it leaves people with no choices but to follow by whatever means that is available to them in terms of regime change. Whether it is orchestrated by the military or by other means, they tend to be supporting these regime change across Africa, which is a very disturbing phenomenon to see in the continent right now.
Mr. Guy, you mentioned a statement about Donald Trump trying to take advantage of what is happening in Nigeria, so to speak. There has been different conversations regarding the high death rates in Nigeria. It has been described as a Christian genocide. Some say mass killing, so to speak. But whatever terminology that is used to describe what is happening in Nigeria currently, the loss of one innocent life is a tragedy that must not be minimized at all. Exactly. And it's all traced to the lack of democratic dividends, inequality between and amongst Nigeria. What should be the right conversations for African leaders? Because if you look at Nigeria, and I always say that on most of the platform that 1 out of every 5 Africans, 1 out of every 5 Africans is in Nigeria. So to a huge extent, the day Nigeria will have stood still as a country, economically and otherwise, Africa will stand still. What should be the right conversation?
I think the security failures in Nigeria is the primary responsibility of the Nigerian state and the Nigerian government. What is stopping them from going in and stopping Boko Haram? The current Nigerian president is eager to poke his mouth into events that are unfolding outside of Nigeria. Yeah. Remember, through ECOWAS, he wanted to invade Niger and stop the military coup. Many will say that it was, according to others from his friend, the French president. In Benin, recently there was a coup attempt, which Nigeria intervened. Yeah. If Nigeria believes that they have such a strong security force in place, what is stopping them from stopping?
That's why I described the Nigerian situation like a tall palm tree that the fruits fall actually from the tree. So, that is, you have the military capability. You can offer that security for your state, but you can offer that to other countries. What an irony. Now, we've discussed bulk of the problems. We've driven close to the end of this conversation. We pinpointed the problem because that's the essence of the Pan-African platform, to critique the African continent, the leadership of the continent, and then prefer a solution. We look at all of the coup d'etat in several quarters of the continent, leadership deficit, lack of democratic dividends. What would be your words to the continent of Africa, especially leadership going forward to ensure that, because no nation, remember, no nation has a right to discuss economic growth in the absence of political stability. And stability starts with the right government offering the requisite democratic dividends. What's your message to African leadership just before we take leave of you? What should they do? You replicate that, you speak that in English language, and you replicate that for Gambia ahead of 2026 election. Yeah. Just a minute.
I think it is very important that we return back to the values of Pan-Africanism, which reminds us who we are as a people, the values that we represent, and the values that we ought to propel in the future. When we borrow from the wisdoms of great Pan-African leaders, I think we will see solutions to our problem, because they have manifested that in their behavior, they've manifested that in their leadership, they've also manifested that in documents that they have left with us behind. And I think we need to build, I'm going to repeat this, a conscious generation of young African leaders moving forward. A future that is driven by young Pan-Africans.
Use a few seconds to speak to the Gambian people in your best or favorite vernacular so that people understand ahead of 2026, peace and stability must be maintained in this country. Few seconds for that, sir.
Wow. Lu ma am puy wax rek mooy réew mi suñ réew la. Elections daanaka mu ngi ñëw 2026. Dafa des si ñun ñu xool lañ lañ bëgg. Ndax nguur gu fi nekk moo ñu gënal wala dañ war a am sañ-sañ soppi doxalin. lii foog naa ne Gambien bu ne am na sañ-sañ ñu jéem koo xoolaat ba def lu nga xam ne mooy mun a isi njëriñ pour suñ réew te foog naa ne lu gën a am solo mooy ñu fexe bay jàmm am fi ndaxte jàmm su amut lu bëri duñ ko mën a am développement du am élection sax du mën a am si réew mi kon lu ñuy wax rek mooy ñu gis réew jiital réew ndaxte jiital réew moo am solo loolu suñ ko amee suñ xol yi ak suñ yéene foog naa ne Gambie buñ bugga dinañ ko mën a am jërëjëf.
That's a great one there for you. It's been a very nice experience having on the platform today. To those of you who've been watching us on Facebook, YouTube, and other social media platform, it remains a Pan-African Drive. We are very super proud and honored to have you follow this online platform here, Teledal TV, your best online outlet, not just in the Gambia, but by extension, the rest of the African continent. Remember, that's all we've got time for today on the Pan-African Drive. The quote of the day says, when wise people fail to speak, fools multiply. That is the reason why we must speak. Those of us who are challenged with changing the negative paradigm shift of the African continent, we must continue to speak, and we must speak until things change. Thank you. It's been a great experience having you with me. So let me get out. Bye-bye.